Well, thanks for joining us today. It's our pleasure, mine and Jessica's pleasure, to be speaking today with Dr. Fiona Rawle. Fiona is a professor in the teaching stream for the Department of Biology and the Institute for the Study of University Pedagogy at the University of Toronto in Mississauga, as well as the Associate Dean of Undergraduate for the University of Toronto, Mississauga, the Director of the Robert Gillespie Academic Skills Centre, and the Acting Chair of the Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence. And it's our absolute pleasure to speak with you today, Fiona, and we look forward to discussing so many pieces of this narrative of failure and hope with you, and are just so thrilled to have you today.
Thank you.
So we're going to get started with sort of the lob ball question. Tell us your story, Fiona. Tell us how you became an educator, an exceptional educator who's won a whole bunch of teaching awards, as well as an educational leader.
So starting with an easy question then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tell us your story. Well, I'm from Vancouver Island and loved science ever since I was a little girl. And so I did a PhD in science. I have a PhD in pathology and molecular medicine. And as I did my PhD, I did a whole bunch of public talks. And it was really interesting to me, misconceptions the public would have about cancer progression or cancer prevention or climate change. And as I did my postdoc and thinking about science, it really crystallized for me that the global challenges we face, be it climate change, pollution, access to clean water, access to sustainable food production, these problems will be solved through education and through people working together. And so I really shifted my focus into the science of learning and education. And I like to say I'm a scientist at heart and by training, so I try to take a scientific approach to learning. And then as we were exploring new ways to teach science, what really resonated that it's all based on relationships. It's based on connecting with people. It's based on sharing stories, sharing narrative, seeing relevance, seeing context. And if we go back to those global challenges, these big problems we face as a society, the answers are going to be found through connection and perspective taking, and folks from political science working with scientists, working with historians, working with sociologists. So that is sort of what inspired me to get to where I am right now.
I have so many questions and I have so much joy in this, right? Like the science of teaching. So, and I love that you identify as a scientist, both in training and in disposition, because I often say that I'm a Shakespearean in training and disposition, and just finished teaching a course on Shakespeare's Guide to Wicked Problems. So taking climate change, taking decolonization, taking anti-Black racism, taking these big wicked problems and pairing them with a Shakespeare play, so that we can get a kind of just a couple of degrees off the looking at it square in the eye, just to see if there's a way that we can intervene, something that we can understand just slightly differently than what we see all the time and are inundated in the news, to just imagine and think differently than we imagine and think, so that we can see better and see differently. And so I'm just, I have like, my little head is going to explode with excitement, because you're tackling wicked problems, both through the science of teaching, but also the ways in which you are engaging in conversations with the public and with community partners. Can you talk us through the ways in which you talk to humans who look at these big wicked problems, like sustainable agriculture or diversity in STEM? And often the sort of response is, it's so big, I don't know where to start. I can't find an entry point in. It is too big and too complex, so I might as well just stay over here and watch Bridgerton and drink wine. Just as an example, not at all describing what I did last week. But, there's a kind of despair and paralysis when we look at the complexity of these big problems that are challenging us as a society and as individuals. How do you intervene, and how do you take people with you in these interventions?
That's such a good question. So I would say that it is big and it is messy, and that is wonderful because there's so many different ways you can get on that on-ramp, if you will. But we are like living in an age of overwhelm where we are exposed to so much information. And at the same time, we are exposed to so much grief about what is happening with the world, and also so much hope in terms of things that are happening. But it's an age of overwhelm. So there's a few things we try to keep in mind with our student teams when we're working with public discourses of science. And one is empathy and lack of shame or stigma, because it can be really easy to say, oh, why don't you know this? Everyone should know this. And it's important to recognize that folks have different backgrounds, folks have different experiences, and everyone is at a different stage of accessing and interacting with information. So that's one thing we really try to highlight. And the other thing is the value of diverse teams. If you don't have a background in this, that's amazing, because you will ask different questions. And so we know that diverse groups ask different questions to solve problems. We know that when experiments fail, diverse groups will try to solve it in different ways. And there's so many examples of that through science and through society. So those are probably the two things we try to highlight, that it's totally okay to not know and to be wrong. And it's really important if you don't know, because you're going to be asking different questions.
So I'll sort of come in and riff off of that. So, when you don't know the answers, or when you fail, right, in your sphere of science or otherwise, how do you pick yourself up? What's the growth mechanism there, right? What's the big sort of like, this is how I move on from that, versus now I spiral into a hole and I'm like, oh, I'm not good enough to be at university, or I'm not good enough to be in science, or I'm not good enough for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah. You said spiral into a hole. That's interesting because, like, in biology and conservation, there's this thing called the extinction vortex, looking at species decline. And sometimes I think of it as like a failure vortex. How do you get yourself out of that failure vortex, where one failure might lead to another, or might lead to shame? And there's different types of failure. There's academic failure. There's failure to meet expectations or goals, or there's failure when you don't learn from mistakes. So one thing we try to emphasize is that failure is part of learning. Failure is absolutely okay, and failure is part of growth, but society doesn't make it easy, and we don't always make it easy on ourselves. And so we have this project called FLIP, which FLIP stands for Failure, Learning, and Progress, that all of our first year students do, to try to normalize not knowing as part of learning. We can't figure out what to study if we're only practicing the easy questions and we're always getting them right. We have to get things wrong, so we know where our knowledge ends or where our knowledge gets muddy. And so we do things where we purposefully get things wrong, and we have to sit with that discomfort and move through it. Something that I think is important to mention is that there is a lot of rhetoric around failure. Like, take risks, fail fast, fail often. And you see that in business education a lot: fail fast, fail often. But when you look at data from banks in the United States, people who get that second loan after the first business failure are usually folks from a background of privilege. And so not everyone has the same permission to fail. So there's equity, access, resources, and it's easier to fail if you have a safety net. So in education, we have to make sure it's truly a safe space to fail. So it's not this empty rhetoric of take risks. Now's the time to experiment. So we look at, like, what supports do students need to feel safe? Are there policies that need to be in place? And then what does feedback look like? Because the way we give feedback can affect whether or not students listen. If we've listened to the students ahead of time, is there this dialogue of failure feedback? Because the professor should be open to that dialogue too.
So many things. I wrote them all down. I have these keywords, and I absolutely am with you on, I wrote an article called We Need to Stop Fetishizing Failure. We need to stop making it something, we need to stop importing it from like the Silicon Valley language into our classrooms, because when we say it and then we assess differently, or we give them, there are consequences to failure that are hidden or invisible, we create something, I think I called it the trust gap. So between what we say and what we do, if that gap is wide, the students will not trust what we say, and they shouldn't, nor should they, because the systems are not in place. And the systems right now, whether that's grading or getting into graduate school or scholarships or bursaries, are not rewarding failure. They're not there, and they're not gentle, and there is not a second loan when you're sort of 20 years old and from, you know, a first generation family who is going to university and navigating all of these inhospitable systems. And I wonder, can we map this from the classroom into the university more widely, or take a sort of wider lens? Because I think what is happening, and I've been thinking about it a lot lately, is what we say we do as universities and what we actually do, there's a gap there, and that gap is widening. And we're seeing the impact of that dissonance between what we say we do and what we actually do start to take on all sorts of different implications. And I think that there is an erosion of public trust in publicly funded social institutions. And just as we need education more, as you say, to tackle these big, complex global issues, we're seeing a sort of erosion of trust because what we say we do and what we do are different. And we seem to be following a model of the business world rather than understanding very clearly what our social mission is to the broader society. And I wonder if you've thought about that in the work that you do in the science of teaching, but also in the science of leading.
Oh, that's really important. So being genuine and following through with structural supports. It's a little bit related, but I wrote an op-ed in the fall because I was there in the spring, sorry. So I wrote an op-ed in the spring and I was really frustrated. And I called it, beware of wellness theater. So I think it was a Wednesday, and I got an email on a Wednesday that was like, Wellness Wednesday, don't check email on Wednesdays. And I was like, this is wellness theater. And there's so many examples of theater in society. By that, I mean, you say something and you don't follow it up with structural support, right? So wellness theater is when you tell people to go for a walk or do yoga or not check email on Wednesdays, and you're expressing goodwill and you're expressing support, but the structural support isn't there. So for what we're doing with science of learning or learning from failure, we can frame things in a positive way, but it only makes a difference if the actual structural support is there. And so maybe this is having additional TAs to help coach students through failure. Maybe this is creating purposeful connections of peer learning groups that are accountable, but it has to have structural support. And there's lots of different examples of theater, like with COVID. We know that COVID is airborne and washing floors is hygiene theater, but it doesn't actually go to the root cause, and it's not actually helpful. So I would say, to that end, we need to make sure we are genuine in our expressions of care. And then those expressions of care are followed up by structural support.
Can I have a follow-up, Pat? Thank you. So as a Shakespearean, right, who is both by training and disposition, you're blowing my mind right now. You're using theater in a way that I had not ever thought about it, because so my world of theater is that in 3 hours or however long the theater is, the sort of performance is, it invites in spectators, not as consumers, but as co-producers and co-designers in a world that unfolds over, say, 3 hours in a physical space through dialogue, conversation, and bodies moving in space. And so for me, theater is a microcosm for society. It's a microcosm for the classroom, or a metaphor for society and for the classroom, because what it does is it says, we are all involved in the co-design of a world that unfolds in real time together. And that if we're doing it right, if we're doing theater right, we're all leaving the theater transformed, but also clearer about our social mission, about the ways in which we can go back into the world and to intervene. And so the word theater that you're using is so interesting.
Very different.
It's totally different.
Yeah.
But there's an element in Shakespeare that is dissembling. And the dissembling is exactly the word that you use, which is genuine. So dissembling is to have two selves, to seem to be one thing, but to actually be something else. And to be a dissembler is to play in those spaces between what you appear to be, which is highly performative, highly stylized, and highly curated for a particular audience, and a core that is genuine and true. And you see in Shakespeare, all of these characters who cannot dissemble fall into traps and get caught because they don't see the difference between those. Othello is one of them. He gets completely fooled by Iago, who can dissemble. He can seem to be different things to different audiences. Yeah. So I don't think we're in opposition. I think we're totally talking about similar things, but with different language. And
when I say theater, I mean like performative and an act that stops on stage. It's not like that Shakespeare experience.
Yeah, that you
act
don't
versus experience.
Yeah, that there is, and there's something really dangerous. And I see this in the kind of consumer culture that we have right now, is that you can go and watch Bridgerton and escape from the world, but you're not asked to go and do anything about it. You're in fact asked to just park your brain, your heart, and your soul at the door, be entertained, consume something that makes you feel good, even as it is ephemeral, and then to go back into the world with a catharsis, with a sort of like release of energy, not to learn anything, but to go back and to have to continue to work in deteriorating conditions. And I love that Wellness Wednesday. We have Wellness Wednesdays, and every time I get one, I want to scream into the abyss, because I'm like, don't tell me to breathe. I can't breathe. Nobody can. I'm not going to drink water. Like this is beyond that. And yet the people in the roles that are trying to make us feel better are actually unintentionally harming us. So what do we do with it? How do we, if we can name it as uncomfortable, where do we aim it? What are we supposed to do?
And I think for this, a lot of this comes to time, because we can give students support groups and peer networks and extra assignments, but if we don't protect time for them so that the work can be slow and they can pause rather than rushed, then it's not going to have the outcomes we need. And so to do that, we have to look beyond one course. We have to look at all the courses that students are taking and all the support that they're accessing. So a big part of that is breaking down some of these silos that rise up between disciplines or between units at the university.
And we're definitely not good at that, breaking down silos. And we're not good at, like, the students are getting this not just at university, but they've had it all through their high school years, right? Where everything is, here's your 76-minute block of this. And when you're done school, your parents have programmed you into like soccer, followed by choir, followed by whatever else, right? Like it's giving folks space and just letting them have the time to stumble and fumble and work their way through things is not a strong suit of North American society. It is probably the strong suit in other places, but certainly not here. And what that brings me to is the sort of the spaces and the terminology, but also the juxtaposition of some of the things that we say and do, right? So we talk about vulnerability, and we talk about that in relation to failure, right? And we talk about growth, and we talk about hope, and we talk about despair, right? Like, so how do we put all of those things on a spectrum? How do we say, we want you to be vulnerable and we want you to fail, but that's not going to work with everything that you've already been, engaged with, or we're offering you a safe space and a brave space, but, that only comes if you have X amount of privilege, right? Or things like that. So how do we wrestle with that, or how do you wrestle with that, Fiona? Or how do you see it being wrestled with at universities?
Yeah, I think that vulnerability is a core part of learning. And we mentioned earlier about being wrong and being comfortable with being wrong and admitting that you were wrong. And that can be really hard for some of us, especially if we are in a precarious position. If someone is in a position of precarity, or someone is on scholarship and needs a certain grade to maintain that. And so I think a lot of this comes down to these pedagogies of care and kindness that focus on connection. Because when we share vulnerabilities, we're connecting, and relationships are at the core of learning. In order for relationships to be valuable, they need to be genuine, they need to be vulnerable, and they need to be open. And I think one thing that has really been challenging for that is this position of this like expert on the stage with the professor. The professor is right and the professor knows best, rather than recognizing the professor as a partner in learning that's helping to facilitate learning. So I think in terms of that juxtaposition that you asked about, we have to shift that view of the professor as is not an expert to disseminate something. It's more of a guide and a partner in learning. And if professors feel more comfortable to share vulnerabilities, then I think that can help have a more meaningful relationship with students. And I think also this idea that failure is bad, we need to get rid of that. Like, absolutely, some types of failures are bad. Some are because of bad choices, some are just bad luck. But there's a whole bunch of failures related to trying out new things and taking risks and figuring things out that we can celebrate.
I totally agree. And it resonates for me because I work a lot with faculty members. So I teach in classrooms, but I also work a lot with the outliers and innovators across many universities in Canada and beyond. And one of the things that I have found is that students, when they trust you and when they trust that it is a safe and brave space where they can model their own vulnerability and see it modeled for them, they're like, yes, thank goodness, this is a relief. Yes, messy journey. We're crossing a threshold. We're experiencing discomfort. Once they're given the language and the framework, they're pretty open to learning new ways. But I find that faculty are way more armored and blocked and resistant to being vulnerable, resisting sharing vulnerability. Even full professors who are not at all precarious, there's a kind of shame and a kind of grief sort of that has been, I think, trained into them for so long that there's a bigger and more disruptive process of unlearning that has to happen for them to be broken open rather than being broken apart. And I just wonder about this, shifting the view of the sage on the stage as an authority. There's a lot of work that they have to do about their self view, their view of themselves and their identities. And I wonder if we can think about how the systems themselves don't value faculty being vulnerable or opening up to these unlearning, but where we can intervene, whether that's promotion, evaluation, review, whether that's hiring, that's ongoing professional development, that is reverse mentorship. But what systems and structures do we need to put into place to shift the view of faculty themselves from sage on the stage to guide on the side, or whatever rhymes for you, but a new way of thinking about authority and expertise?
Yeah, I think there are institutional cultures and disciplinary norms that work against vulnerability sometimes. And these professors have come up through those systems. So another thing to consider is that, like with students trusting professors have to earn that trust. We can't say, you can trust me and expect that it will follow. We can't say this is a safe space and expect that students will feel safe. So we have to demonstrate that and earn that. And I think it's similarly true for professors. We can't say to professors, it's okay, be vulnerable, when we know there's really well-documented bias in student evaluations of teaching around vulnerability. There's well-documented bias, gender bias, racial bias, sexuality bias in student evaluations of teaching. So I think we have to figure out how we can earn professors' trust in the context of a broader system that historically has penalized vulnerability. And so I think one thing we have to do is recognize who holds the power in those systems to change those systems.
I'm going to swoop in and ask Jessica's big question here, because this is the one that she usually puts on the table, but it fits so perfectly right now. So Fiona, thinking about those big systems and the problems that are there in those big systems, and X, Y, and Z that's documented as being systematic failures in those systems. If you had to redesign the university, right? If you had this hopeful outlook on what could we do better, where could we do better, how we could do better, what would that look like for you?
Such a great question. And it might be easier to say what it isn't rather than what it is. It is not an institution where grades are foundational, right? So in terms of what it is, if we go back to the global issues we talked at the beginning, so global climate change, access to clean water, sustainable agriculture, pollution, escalating cancer rates and detection, all those problems are going to be solved by people working together. And so a new type of university I would want at its core to be relational, to highlight the value of relationships to learning, the value of relationships to innovation. Because when we think about what gives life meaning, you look at all the surveys and the studies that exist for people's perspective at the end of their lives in terms of what gives life meaning. And the answer almost always comes back to relationships. And so if this is what gives life meaning, shouldn't that be the core of university practice? So my short answer would be that its practice would be relational and focus on relationships.
And no grading.
And no grades. However, there would be feedback. Like feedback is part of relationships and community and culture and connection. And so feedback is foundational, but grades are not.
Yeah. I love that word. The Maple League has, they just finished the book club on ungrading this semester. And, we had like 80 people go through this, and we did them in small little communities of practice, and people came with varying degrees of relationship and holding on to grades. And a lot of people in the early sessions, we did over 12 weeks and broke them down into chapters, came with this. But what about rigor? What about academic integrity? What about standards? What about professional designations and credentializing? And by the end, most of them were evangelical. Let's challenge and dismantle these systems, because rigor, I always think when somebody uses the word rigor, first of all, it's an excuse to not be compassionate, right? It's a sort of blunt instrument that you bash over people's heads so that they get harder and not softer, which is not a compelling argument for me. But I always think of rigor as rigor mortis, as this sort of like rigid, inhospitable, impervious, dead thing that has that blocks living and breathing and growing and adapting and being joyful and messy and all of the imperfections that make us human. But it was really interesting to see, 80 people go through their own journeys around their relationship. Well, wait a second. I became a professor because I understood the system, and I understood how value circulated in that system, and I understood how to game that system in order to maximize my results and minimize my work. Or not minimize, but work effectively, work smart. And I've been rewarded for that my entire trajectory. So it is understandable for people who've been rewarded in that system and who have thrived in that system to reproduce those systems unreflectively, and to not realize until you surface those deep assumptions that grades for a number of us become ways that we understand uncomfortably that maybe we're gatekeepers, maybe we're the problem, and maybe we've internalized systems that no longer serve us or the discipline or never did.
Yeah.
So
and the rhetoric of rigor is a core institutional norm that instructors have been exposed to since they were in school. So it's not surprising that some will hold on to that rhetoric.
And it even is as ingrained as like, I can't possibly teach this course in anything less than 12 weeks, because I know 12 weeks is the magical number that I have to teach this in. Couldn't possibly do it in 11 or 10.
That's something else we should change for like new university is completely re-examine time and speed and how much we rush.
Mm-hmm.
Can I go back just to the rhetoric of rigor and connect it to something that you talked about earlier, which was shame? Is the rhetoric of rigor rooted in shame? Insofar as I'm thinking about sort of the context of the universities I work within, and we have austerity. So we have lack. We never have enough time. We never have enough resources. We never have enough staff. We never have enough X. And over time, I have seen new faculty come in and we never have enough X to I'm never going to be enough. And what that does, I think, in institutional cultures and disciplinary norms is to bake shame into the walls and to overcompensate for lack by creating impervious or, armored spaces. And to unlearn that requires us to surface our discomfort and to name that shame and to understand how systems have consistently and repeatedly said, even to privileged historical majorities, you are not enough. And you need to hustle, you need to make a case for yourself, you need to demonstrate impact, you're never going to be enough. And I wonder if the rhetoric of rigor, this is just a half-cooked thought, as you two were talking, do we treat it with the kind of critical empathy that it comes in its roots from something of lack?
That's really interesting. I think with shame and the rhetoric of rigor, shame is one of the threads, but there are sort of other threads wrapped around as well, because I think we have the scarcity mindset related to budgets or positions or number of students we can take in research positions. And then that scarcity mindset leads us to think, oh, meritocracy is the way, right? And if we are rigorous, we will only select the quote best or the quote excellent. But what does excellent even mean? And when we are applying rhetorics of rigor, I think what's happening is we're reinforced biases. And these systems are reinforcing biases that are inequitable. So I think those are other threads that are in there. But then the exclusion that happens is absolutely connected to scarcity mindset, and then that's connected to shame.
And just thinking on that time scale, right? We've been talking about not having enough time and needing to re-examine time. I'm wondering if, like, as you've seen this play out, let's just say in the last 5 years, right? Like, do you see some inherent changes, or maybe what would you like to see as changes if we talk about a pre-COVID, where we are right now, and where we might be going based on some of these issues, whether it's around equity, whether it's about scarcity of resources, whether it's about simple things like internet broadband availability, right? Like, do you see these things changing over time?
Yeah, I really do. And I think for some things, we don't realize how important they are to us until we don't have them.
Mm.
And for a lot of students and faculty that we work with during the pandemic, a lot of that came back to relationships and connection and the value of connection and connecting in different ways. And so I think something that happened with the shift to online and the shift to remote with the COVID-19 pandemic is people realizing how important meaningful connection is and realizing how that can be achieved in different ways. So I'm hoping some of the flexibility of online connection we'll take with us, but then we will also slow down to try to cultivate meaningful connection in different ways. So I think that will come forward. And I think this is a thing about crises, is they can be wonderful opportunities to reflect and re-examine and shift course if we are supported and if we have structural supports to do so. So I really hope we don't go back to normal because that wasn't working for a whole swath of our student body. So I'm hoping that we, moving forward, this increased value that's been placed on connection, I hope that keeps moving forward.
Yeah, we were just discussing the Slow Professor, the book by Maggie Berg and one of her colleagues at Queen's, and we're looking at it as a spring book club for our communities of practice across the Maple League, and available to any of you who want to join. We're actively recruiting and open to, we've got 60 plus universities that participate regularly in our programming, because I think there's a real need to have those conversations about, we can't go back to normal, but what are we going to do? Like, how do we change that? And the Slow Professor, we've been back and forth about this choice because it got some criticism when it was first released, because being slow and slowing down is a privilege of the full professor, or a privilege of the student who doesn't have to work a part-time or full-time job, support their families, commute, and manage a whole host of other kinds of responsibilities. It is really hard to think about what Slow Professor as the slow cooking movement, it was inspired by the slow cooking movement, looks like with precarious and contingent faculty and students. But reading it and thinking about it as a systems level shift and mindset and series of behaviors where there's interventions at every level, I think is really important. And it was prescient coming out pre-pandemic in giving us one, not the total guide, but one intervention or one talking point for us to think about designing future-facing spaces that are more hospitable, human and humane, and as you say, relationship rich, right? Founded in the relational, founded in meaningful, authentic, joyful spaces where people are learning alongside one another, rather than learning in power dynamics that can be really harmful. So I wonder if you might want to talk about that, but talk about it maybe through the lens of my favorite of your title. And you have like 5 titles. Yeah, like lead here and running this here and doing this here, and an undergraduate focus, but also diversity and excellence. So the diversity and excellence portfolio, how do we do slow with diversity and excellence? And especially in the lens of, well, excellence traditionally has meant let's reproduce unconscious biases and exclude a whole host of members of equity deserving groups. So what do we do? How do we challenge that to say diversity is excellence and move? That was like 5 questions. You don't have to answer any of them, but these are questions that keep me awake at night.
Yeah. And there's so many places we could go to explore that. But the value of diversity is just mind-boggling. It's amazing people aren't shouting this from rooftops for the best ways to build teams and to work on projects. And this should not be something that's under debate. And there's so many examples we could look at. Like when YouTube first came out with its direct upload to YouTube app. So Google owns YouTube and they're famous for their beta testing. They don't make mistakes. They went through the development phase, beta testing, launched worldwide, failed 5 to 10% of the time. 5 to 10% of the time, the image was upside down. The upload didn't work. It was considered a failure. And do you know why? It's because there were no left-handers on their development or beta test team, because left-handed people hold their phone in a different orientation. And they had to come up with a statement saying, no, we're not biased against left-handers. We had poor diversity on our team. It's like, yes, you need diversity on your teams. We know that like Fortune 500 companies make more money when their teams are diverse. We know that groups of scientists ask different questions when their teams are diverse. Like for bird watchers and ornithologists, it was thought for 150 years that only male birds had complex song in certain parts of the globe. And it wasn't until more women were being trained with PhDs in animal behavior and directing the studies, it was discovered that actually female birds in these regions have really complex song, and complex song evolved first in females. There's so many examples we could talk about with diversity. And so it can be a little frustrating when people still need to be convinced of this, because there's so many examples out there. And so that's one thing, is just to keep talking about it and how exciting it is that you can get to different answers through different paths. So this goes back to recreating the university, this idea that there's only one right answer or one right way. And on my midterms and my final exams, they always end with an essay, and the students have to design an experiment, and they get points for creativity. And this is deeply uncomfortable because there's no one right answer, and there shouldn't be. Like it can be interesting and messy and creative. And yes, it should be a well-designed experiment, but there's lots of ways you could go with it. And so you asked 5 questions, and I don't think I answered any of those questions in that answer. But going back to the equity, diversity, and inclusion aspect of some of the things we've discussed, something that this group I'm involved in, this TIDE group, Toronto Initiative for Diversity and Excellence, on one of our slides, it says there's this like false narrative between institutions are made of people. People have to change. We need to focus on bias awareness for people because people make up institutions. And then, oh, like people can't change systemic problems. We have to focus on institutional and structural change. And it's not one or the other. We have to be doing both, and they have to inform each other, and they're continual. So with that, I would say we have to be doing both. We have to look at personal awareness and personal actions to minimize bias, but then we have to look at structural change.
That's also important. And to bring another sort of book into the conversation, at Nipissing, we have a book club as well, right? And our next one it's called Transforming Universities in the Midst of a Global Crisis. And it's creating a university for the common good. And it's sort of, in looking at that book, we were sort of like, these poor authors, they started this book pre-COVID, right? So they probably added the in the midst of the global crisis after the fact, like after they already had the contract. But it's so cool that they took it and they ran with it and they put it out anyway, right? Now, how much of it is dated? That's a pre-COVID thing, or how much of it is wholly relevant now? But it's the strength in, here's our situation, and we've got some new variables that we didn't know existed in 2019 when we started this thing, but let's roll with it anyway. And so I haven't read it yet, but it seems like it'll be interesting to see where a small university in Northern Ontario aligns with this large Australian cohort of authors, in terms of, it's the same everywhere. We're running into the same problems. We need to do this at an individual level. We need to do this at a systematic level. We need to do this at every single level and then some, right? And in both the spaces of privilege, but also the spaces that are equity deserving and so on and so forth. So, but I have one question for you. One sort of, I don't know if this is a last question or a like, here you go, another great big huge big picture question. But Fiona, when you think about teaching and learning, and you think about universities, and you think about higher ed in general, and all these bits and pieces, what is it that keeps you up at night? Right? What is the like, or conversely, what is it that gets you up in the morning, right? To be like, I'm going to go and I'm going to combat that. Maybe they're the same thing, maybe they're not. Who knows?
I think they are related, but if something's stopping me from sleeping, it's probably related to some of these global challenges like global climate change.
Yeah.
Because I'm deeply concerned about where we are headed and what we're going to need to do to be okay. But on the same point, probably what gets me out of bed in the morning is that I have so much hope for what we can do. And that comes back to relationships. Like, what gives my life meaning are my relationships with my family, friends, colleagues, and students. Right. So I think they're definitely related. One stops me from sleeping and one helps me get out of bed with joy.
And we really are in a world of hope, right? We have sort of institutionally mandated hope in, like, as a fundamental, what we say we are as.
It's a Wellness Wednesday. Come on.
It is not. It can't be performative. It can't be dissembling, but there's nothing more hopeful than learning, because when you set out, you are willing to challenge the actual in the name of the possible, as Ira Shore says in Empowering Students. You're willing to think differently than you think and see differently than you see. And you're willing to do that with other people in both individual learning journeys and in communal spaces. And for the audacity of hope of our young people to walk in to a classroom and say, I don't know, break me open. Let's build something together, and to trust us enough and to trust the process enough to feel the discomfort of an reconstituting of their self. There's nothing more hopeful than that. And I think that we've got to really, to use, as a secular human, a sacred responsibility here to build systems that allow for this hope to flourish and for our humans to flourish, both as individuals and in inextricably bound up ways with one another. And so I'm just so grateful for you walking us through, like, you've taken us through the whole journey of that hope, which is sort of starting with relationships, moving into the age of overwhelm, surfacing grief and shame, resisting the rhetoric of failure as a fetishizing, but to sit in the genuine nature of the discomfort, of vulnerability, to think through and reimagine power dynamics and power relations, to think about the ways in which we shift the view of the professor and expertise and authority to make space for diversity as excellence and hope as a verb, right? Hope in action. So I've written all sorts of stuff, and I'm like, okay, we need to follow up on the rhetoric of rigor.
We actually have an op-ed we're writing right now, and the title is "Beware the Rhetoric of Rigor."
Oh, I can't wait. I cannot wait to read it, because I think it's really, really important. And I think that when you give people language, when you invite it into conversation, when you give people a framework, there is a huge amount of critical reflection that can happen, right? That instead of saying you're doing this wrong, and be like, these are systems and structures that you are surviving but not flourishing in. What kind of processes of unlearning and relearning do we have to do? I think that is so tremendously powerful. So I really want to express my deep gratitude for this conversation and for all of the seeds that you've planted, which I'm sure will grow in lovely future kinds of ways.
Thank you so much.
Plus, my husband is a massive bird watcher, so I'm going to go talk to him about.
Guess what, Rob? The bird calls were all from.
There's a wonderful article in The Conversation. You can Google it, but it goes through the history of women scientists in birdsong, and it's really interesting.
I love it. I'm going to Google that.
Thanks so much, Fiona. It's been an absolute pleasure to chat with you this afternoon, and just zing ideas off of one another and go from there. So thanks so much for that.
Thanks, Pat.